The magnolia blossoms hung heavy in the humid Louisiana air that August evening in 1854, their white petals already browning at the edges like old parchment. In the grand dining room of the Beaumont plantation, crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across mahogany furniture that had been polished to mirror perfection. The scent of jasmine drifted through open French doors, mingling with something else, something metallic and sharp that none of the 15 guests seated around the elaborate table could yet identify. Before we delve deeper into this haunting chapter of Louisiana history, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? What time is it in your part of the world? Drop a comment below, because what you're about to hear is a story that has been deliberately erased from historical records, buried beneath layers of shame and silence for over a century and a half. The Beaumont estate sprawled across 3,000 acres of prime Louisiana sugarcane country, where the Mississippi River curved like a lazy serpent through rich, alluvial soil. Judge Octavius Beaumont ruled over this domain with the same iron authority he wielded in the courtrooms of Baton Rouge, his reputation built on eloquent speeches about property rights and the natural order of society. Born into one of Louisiana's oldest planter families in 1798, Octavius had inherited not just land, but a worldview that justified human bondage as both economically necessary and morally correct. His grandfather had fought alongside Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans, and his father had helped draft some of Louisiana's most restrictive slave codes. The family's wealth had been built over 3 generations on the backs of enslaved labor, with each successive Beaumont adding to both their acreage and their human property through strategic marriages and ruthless business practices. By 1854, Octavius controlled not only the plantation, but significant interests in sugar processing, riverboat transportation, and the New Orleans slave market itself. His wife, Cordelia Trastor Beaumont, came from an equally prominent Creole family, whose roots in Louisiana stretched back to the colonial period. Her dowry had included both money and enslaved people, cementing an alliance between 2 of the most powerful planter dynasties in the region. Cordelia managed their household staff of 63 enslaved people with what she called refined discipline, a system of rewards and punishments that she had learned from her mother and refined through decades of practice. She kept meticulous records of every enslaved person on the property, documenting their skills, health, family relationships, and any infractions that might require correction. Her leather-bound ledgers contained detailed notes about personality traits, work performance, and breeding potential, treating human beings with the same systematic approach that other plantation mistresses might apply to livestock management. The Beaumont children had been raised to see slavery not as a necessary evil, but as a positive good, a civilizing force that elevated both races by establishing proper hierarchical relationships. Their eldest son, Octavius Jr., had followed his father into law and politics, serving in the state legislature and building his own reputation as an eloquent defender of Southern institutions. At 32, he possessed his father's intellectual gifts combined with an even more fervent belief in white supremacy, frequently writing articles for New Orleans newspapers about the scientific evidence for racial hierarchy. His wife, Isabel, was the daughter of a Mississippi plantation owner and brought her own complement of enslaved people to the marriage, along with strong opinions about proper management techniques that sometimes conflicted with Cordelia's methods. The middle child, Amelia, had married a sugar planter from Assumption Parish, consolidating another important business alliance, while producing 3 grandchildren who would inherit both wealth and the values that had created it. Her husband, Claude Boudreau, owned 2 plantations and was known throughout Louisiana for his innovative approaches to sugar cultivation and his harsh treatment of enslaved workers who failed to meet production quotas. Amelia had embraced her role as a plantation mistress with enthusiasm, often visiting neighboring properties to share management strategies and compare notes about dealing with difficult slaves. The youngest son, Henri, had recently returned from his studies at Tulane University with new ideas about scientific racism and modern management techniques. At 21, He combined his family's traditional arrogance with the intellectual fashions of his generation, having been influenced by the racial theories that were becoming popular in American universities. His senior thesis had examined the cranial measurements of different racial groups, using pseudoscientific methods to support conclusions about innate intellectual differences. Henri saw himself as a progressive thinker who would modernize the family's operations by applying the latest scientific knowledge to the management of human property, never recognizing the fundamental contradiction between his enlightened self-image and his casual acceptance of human bondage. Their 3 adult children had gathered that evening for what was supposed to be a celebration of the judge's appointment to the Louisiana Supreme Court, bringing with them spouses, children, and close family friends who represented the cream of antebellum society. The guest list read like a catalog of Louisiana's political and social elite, men and women whose names appeared regularly in newspaper society pages and whose influence shaped the destiny of thousands of enslaved souls throughout the state. Each family represented at the dinner table had built their wealth and status on the systematic exploitation of human labor, and their gathering represented a concentration of power that extended far beyond their individual plantations to encompass banks, shipping companies, newspapers, and political institutions throughout the South. Among the guests sat Senator Beauregard Thibodeau, a rotund man whose florid speaking style had made him one of the most recognizable defenders of slavery in Congress. His speeches were regularly reprinted in newspapers throughout the South, and his arguments about the constitutional protections for slave property had been cited by courts in multiple states. Thibodeau owned 4 plantations in different parishes, with a total enslaved population of over 400 people, making him one of the largest slaveholders in Louisiana. He had recently returned from Washington with news about growing abolitionist sentiment in the North and strategies for countering what he saw as attacks on Southern civilization. His wife, Evangeline, held court among the plantation mistresses at the table, her conversation flowing seamlessly from the latest fashions imported from Paris to the practical challenges of managing large household staffs. She was known throughout Louisiana society for her elaborate dinner parties and her strong opinions about the proper training of house servants, having written a manual for other plantation wives about maintaining discipline among domestic slaves. Evangeline owned enslaved people in her own right, inherited from her father's estate, and was particularly proud of her seamstresses, who produced clothing that rivaled anything available in New Orleans. Dr. Armand Rousseau represented the medical establishment that provided scientific legitimacy for racial oppression, his practice catering exclusively to wealthy white families, while he developed theories about biological differences between the races. He had studied medicine in Paris before returning to Louisiana, where he combined European medical training with American racial ideology to create a worldview that portrayed slavery as beneficial to the health and development of African peoples. Rousseau regularly published articles in medical journals about the supposed anatomical and physiological differences that made enslaved people naturally suited for manual labor, and he served as an expert witness in court cases involving the sale of allegedly diseased slaves. His wife, Marianne, was the daughter of a prominent New Orleans merchant family and brought connections to the commercial networks that sustained the plantation economy. She was particularly interested in the domestic science movement and had strong opinions about the proper nutrition and health management of enslaved workers, viewing them primarily as capital investments that required maintenance to preserve their value. Colonel James Fortier had built his wealth through a combination of plantation ownership and military contracting, supplying the U.S. Army with horses, food, and other materials during the Mexican War and various Indian conflicts. His plantation specialized in breeding horses, but he also raised cotton and sugar while maintaining a private militia that could be called upon to suppress slave rebellions or capture runaways. Fortier was known for his brutal discipline and his use of tracking dogs that had gained a fearsome reputation throughout Louisiana. He frequently rented out his services to other plantation owners who needed assistance recapturing escaped slaves, and his success rate had made him wealthy enough to purchase additional property and enslaved people. His wife, Celeste, came from an old Creole family and was particularly proud of her French ancestry, often speaking disparagingly about Anglo-American plantation owners who lacked her family's cultural refinement. She managed her household with rigid attention to protocol and hierarchy, demanding that enslaved people demonstrate appropriate deference through elaborate rituals of submission. Judge Lafayette Boudreau, Claude's father, and Amelia's father-in-law, served on the Louisiana Supreme Court alongside Judge Beaumont, and had authored several important decisions that strengthened legal protections for slave property. His judicial opinions were frequently cited by courts throughout the South, and he was considered one of the foremost legal experts on questions relating to slavery and racial law. Boudreau owned a plantation in Assumption Parish and a townhouse in New Orleans, dividing his time between judicial duties and the management of his agricultural interests. He was particularly interested in the legal questions surrounding slave breeding and had written extensively about the property rights of masters and the offspring of enslaved women. His wife, Marguerite, was known for her charitable work among white families, but maintained strict boundaries when it came to the treatment of enslaved people, whom she viewed as fundamentally different from whites in their moral and intellectual capacity. What none of these distinguished guests knew was that their fate had already been sealed in the sweltering kitchen below, where a woman named Jemima moved with the practiced grace of someone who had spent 15 years perfecting not just the art of cooking, but the science of survival in a world that viewed her as property, rather than a human being with thoughts, feelings, and an unbreakable will to protect what she loved most. Jemima had been born into slavery on a rice plantation in South Carolina in 1814, during the final year of the War of 1812, when British forces were encouraging enslaved people to seek freedom behind their lines. Her mother, Aminata, had been brought from West Africa as a child and carried within her memories of traditional healing practices and botanical knowledge that would prove crucial to her daughter's later actions. From her earliest childhood, Jemima had accompanied her mother on expeditions to gather wild plants for medicines, learning to identify dozens of different species and understand their properties through careful observation and traditional teachings passed down through generations of African healers. This education took place in secret, during the brief periods when they could escape the constant surveillance of overseers and venture into the swamps and forests that surrounded the plantation. Aminata taught her daughter not just which plants could heal various ailments, but also which ones could cause harm, explaining that knowledge was power and that survival sometimes required understanding both sides of nature's arsenal. When Jemima was 12 years old, her master's death resulted in the liquidation of the entire plantation, with families torn apart as individual enslaved people were sold to different buyers throughout the South. She watched as her mother was purchased by a buyer heading to Georgia, her younger sibling sold to a cotton planter from Alabama, and her father bought by a sugar plantation owner from Louisiana. The trauma of this separation would shape the rest of her life, instilling in her a deep understanding of the arbitrary cruelty that defined the slave system and the complete powerlessness that enslaved people faced when white owners made decisions about their fate. Jemima herself was purchased by a slave trader who specialized in young domestic servants, recognizing her intelligence and potential trainability as qualities that would command high prices in urban markets. She spent 6 months in a New Orleans slave pen, learning to present herself in ways that would appeal to potential buyers while secretly observing the sophisticated urban environment that surrounded her. The slave market in New Orleans was one of the largest in North America, and Jemima witnessed hundreds of sales that reinforced her understanding of how thoroughly the economic system of the South depended on treating human beings as commodities. She saw families destroyed, children sold away from parents, and husbands separated from wives, all conducted with the casual efficiency of any other business transaction. It was during this period that she began to understand not just her own vulnerability but the systematic nature of the oppression that surrounded her, recognizing that her suffering was not unique but part of a deliberate structure designed to extract profit from human misery. In early 1839, When Jemima was 25, she was purchased as part of a group sale that brought several new enslaved people to the Beaumont plantation. Judge Beaumont had decided to upgrade his domestic staff, and the slave trader had assembled a collection of skilled workers who could enhance the reputation of his household. Jemima was initially assigned to work in the main house as a general servant, but her intelligence and adaptability quickly caught the attention of Cordelia Beaumont, who was always looking for ways to improve the efficiency and elegance of her domestic operations. Within months, Jemima had been transferred to the kitchen, where she began learning from Marie Tant, an elderly woman who had been cooking for the Beaumont family since Judge Beaumont's father had owned the plantation. Marie Tant was a remarkable figure who had survived decades of bondage through a combination of indispensable skills and careful political navigation of the complex social dynamics that defined plantation life. Born in Haiti during the Revolutionary period, she had been brought to Louisiana as a child when her French master fled the slave uprising that had transformed the Caribbean. Her cooking combined French techniques learned from professional chefs with African traditions preserved through oral transmission and Creole innovations developed through decades of experimentation with local ingredients. Marie Tante had also learned to read and write, skills that were technically illegal for enslaved people but which she had acquired through careful observation and secret practice. She maintained notebooks written in a mixture of French, Creole, and coded symbols that documented not just recipes but also her observations about the local plant life, weather patterns, and the behavior of the white family she served. These notebooks represented a form of resistance through knowledge preservation, maintaining intellectual autonomy in a system designed to reduce enslaved people to mere physical labor. Under Marie Tante's guidance, Jemima's natural culinary abilities flourished, but she also received an education that went far beyond cooking techniques. The old woman taught her to read and write, using biblical verses and recipe cards as textbooks, while developing a teaching method that could be quickly abandoned if discovery threatened. Marie Tante shared her knowledge of local plants, explaining which ones could be used for healing various ailments, and which ones had more dangerous properties that required careful handling. She spoke in whispers about the traditional practices of their ancestors, the spiritual beliefs that connected them to forces beyond the material world, and the importance of maintaining dignity and humanity, even in the most dehumanizing circumstances. Most importantly, she taught Jemima to observe and understand the white family they served, analyzing their personalities, preferences, and vulnerabilities, with the same systematic attention that they might apply to studying the behavior of dangerous animals. This education was not motivated by malice but by survival, understanding that enslaved people who could anticipate and manage the moods of their owners were more likely to avoid punishment and protect their families from arbitrary cruelty. Marie Tante had witnessed generations of violence and had learned that knowledge was the most important tool for navigating a world where enslaved people had no legal rights or protections. When Marie Tante died of pneumonia in the winter of 1844, she left behind more than just her position as head cook. She bequeathed to Jemima a complete worldview that combined practical skills with intellectual resistance and moral clarity about the nature of the system that oppressed them. Her notebooks became Jemima's most treasured possessions, studied by candlelight during the brief hours when she could pursue learning without detection. The coded sections took months to decipher, revealing information about plants and their properties that went beyond anything that could be found in conventional medical texts. Some entries described traditional remedies for common ailments, others documented the effects of various plants on different types of animals, and a few contained information about substances that could cause symptoms ranging from mild discomfort to death, all presented in the neutral language of scientific observation rather than explicit instructions for harm. As Jemima assumed Marie Tante's role, she quickly established herself as one of the finest cooks in Louisiana, her meals drawing praise from guests who traveled from throughout the region to experience what they called the magic of the Beaumont kitchen. Her reputation became part of the family's social standing, with Judge Beaumont frequently boasting to his colleagues about the quality of his table and the skill of his cook. This recognition gave Jemima a form of protection that was rare among enslaved people, her value to the family's reputation, making her too important to sell or punish harshly for minor infractions. However, this elevated status also made her acutely aware of her fundamental powerlessness, as she understood that her value was contingent on her continued usefulness, and that any change in circumstances could result in her being sold away from everything and everyone she cared about. During her first decade at the Beaumont plantation, Jemima built relationships within the enslaved community while carefully maintaining the facade of loyal service that her position required. She married Samuel, a skilled carpenter who had been born on the plantation and understood its rhythms and dangers better than anyone. Their wedding was conducted according to enslaved customs rather than legal ceremonies, since Louisiana law did not recognize marriages between enslaved people, but their commitment to each other provided emotional stability in an environment designed to prevent the formation of lasting bonds. Samuel shared Jemima's intelligence and literacy, having learned to read from previous generations of enslaved people who had maintained educational networks despite legal prohibitions and violent punishments for anyone caught teaching or learning. Together, they created a small space of intellectual and emotional freedom within the broader constraints of bondage, sharing books and ideas while dreaming of possibilities that seemed impossible given their circumstances. Their first child, Celeste, was born in 1843, bringing both joy and terror into their lives as they confronted the reality of raising a child who would be born into slavery with no legal rights or protections. They devoted themselves to providing her with love, education, and moral guidance, while knowing that her future was ultimately controlled by people who viewed her as property rather than a human being with inherent dignity and potential. Jemima taught Celeste to read using the same methods that Marie Tante had used with her, while Samuel shared his knowledge of carpentry and his understanding of the plantation's social dynamics. They tried to prepare their daughter for the realities of enslaved life while preserving her sense of self-worth and humanity, a delicate balance that required constant vigilance and creativity. When Celeste turned 8, their worst fears materialized as Cordelia Beaumont decided that the child showed promise as a house servant and should be moved into the main house where her training could be more closely supervised. This separation was presented as an opportunity for advancement, but Jemima understood it as another example of the arbitrary power that white owners exercised over enslaved families. The decision was made without consultation or consideration for the emotional impact on either mother or child, reflecting the fundamental assumption that enslaved people's feelings were irrelevant to economic and social calculations. Celeste was given a small pallet in a storage room near the kitchen, close enough that Jemima could see her occasionally, but far enough that meaningful interaction became nearly impossible during working hours. The child adapted to her new circumstances with the resilience that enslaved children learned early, but Jemima watched with heartbreak as her daughter began to develop the hypervigilance and emotional guardedness that marked people who had learned that survival depended on anticipating and managing the unpredictable moods of those with absolute power over their lives. Celeste learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when members of the white family were in good or bad moods, adjusting her behavior accordingly to avoid punishment or displeasure. She became skilled at making herself invisible when tensions ran high, and at performing the elaborate rituals of deference that white owners demanded as proof of their slaves' acceptance of their inferior status. This transformation was necessary for survival, but Jemima recognized it as a form of psychological violence that robbed her daughter of the natural spontaneity and confidence that should characterize childhood development. The second major trauma in Jemima's life occurred in 1849 when she gave birth to a son, Pierre, whose arrival brought both celebration and renewed anxiety about the challenges of protecting children in an environment where their welfare depended entirely on the whims of people who viewed them as property. Pierre was a bright, energetic child who inherited his parents' intelligence and curiosity, but his liveliness sometimes brought unwanted attention from members of the white family who had firm opinions about appropriate behavior for enslaved children. Judge Beaumont believed that slave children should be taught discipline and obedience from an early age, and he frequently intervened when he felt that parents were being too lenient or permissive in their child-rearing approaches. This philosophy had been shaped by his reading of contemporary texts about plantation management that emphasized the importance of establishing hierarchical relationships early in life to prevent future problems with adult slaves. Cordelia shared her husband's views about the need for strict discipline, but she was particularly focused on ensuring that enslaved children learned proper deference behaviors that would make them more valuable as adult workers. She had strong opinions about everything from how slave children should address white people to the types of games they should be allowed to play, and she did not hesitate to intervene when she felt that parents were failing to instill appropriate attitudes. Her approach was often presented as benevolent concern for the children's future welfare, but it was actually motivated by her desire to shape them into more compliant and useful adult slaves who would accept their subordinate status without question or resistance. The third and most devastating event in Jemima's journey toward revenge occurred on a humid July morning in 1853, when Henri Beaumont's casual cruelty crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Henri had returned from his university studies with new ideas about racial hierarchy and scientific management, but he had also developed the kind of intellectual arrogance that made him particularly dangerous to enslaved people who caught his attention. At 21, he combined his family's traditional sense of superiority with contemporary pseudoscientific theories about racial differences, creating a worldview that justified even more extreme forms of domination and control than previous generations had practiced. On that particular morning, Henri was entertaining friends from New Orleans who had come to visit the plantation and learn about the latest techniques in slave management. The young men represented the next generation of Louisiana's planter elite, and their conversation centered on questions about maintaining discipline, preventing escapes, and maximizing the economic value of human property. They had been discussing various methods of punishment and control when Henri decided to provide a practical demonstration of his marksmanship skills using his new imported rifle from England. The weapon was a precision instrument designed for hunting, with an accuracy that Henri was eager to display to his impressed audience. Initially, the demonstration involved shooting at targets set up around the plantation grounds, bottles and wooden posts that allowed Henri to show off his steady hand and keen eye. His friends applauded each successful shot while making comments about the practical applications of such skills in maintaining order among enslaved populations, who might be tempted to rebel or escape. It was during this escalating display of bravado that Pierre wandered into view, playing with a corn-husk doll that Jemima had made for him during one of their brief evening moments together. The 3-year-old was engaged in the kind of imaginative play that characterizes early childhood, creating voices for his toy and acting out scenarios that reflected his limited understanding of the world around him. His presence provided Henri with an opportunity to demonstrate not just his marksmanship, but his complete disregard for the humanity of enslaved people, treating a toddler as nothing more than an interesting challenge for target practice. The first shot was deliberately aimed high, intended to startle rather than harm, as Henri wanted to show his friends how he could control the situation while building suspense about his ultimate intentions. Pierre looked up at the strange sound with the curious expression that young children display when encountering something new and unexpected, his wide eyes reflecting confusion rather than fear as he tried to understand what was happening. Henri's friends laughed at the child's bewilderment, encouraging their host to continue the demonstration while making crude jokes about the intelligence and reactions of enslaved people. The second shot found its mark with the precision that Henri had been practicing for months, and Pierre crumpled to the ground like a discarded toy, his small body suddenly still, as his blood began to seep into the same rich earth that had nourished generations of Beaumont prosperity. Henri's friends applauded his accuracy while he reloaded his weapon, and announced with satisfaction that he had successfully tested its effectiveness on a moving target, treating the murder of a child as nothing more than a successful experiment in marksmanship. The casual nature of their celebration, the complete absence of any recognition that they had just witnessed the murder of a human being, demonstrated the extent to which the dehumanization inherent in slavery had corrupted their moral sensibilities and transformed them into monsters who could commit atrocities while congratulating themselves on their technical skill. When Jemima's screams brought other members of the plantation community running to the scene, they found Henri calmly cleaning his rifle, while his friends continued their jovial conversation about hunting techniques and weapon maintenance. Judge Beaumont arrived within minutes, summoned by the commotion, and surveyed the situation with the calculating eye of a man assessing property damage rather than confronting the murder of a child. His response was entirely consistent with his worldview and legal training, treating the incident as a minor disruption that required administrative resolution rather than moral reckoning. The judge questioned Henri briefly about the circumstances, accepted his explanation that he had been testing his weapon's accuracy and needed a moving target to properly evaluate its performance, and then proceeded to assign financial responsibility for the destroyed property. The $25 that he deducted from Henri's monthly allowance represented the judge's assessment of Pierre's economic value, calculated according to the standard formulas that slaveholders used to determine the worth of different categories of enslaved people based on their age, health, skills, and expected productive lifespan. This transaction, conducted in the presence of Pierre's lifeless body and his grieving mother, represented the logical conclusion of a system that treated human beings as property to be bought, sold, used, and disposed of, according to the economic interests and personal whims of their owners. The judge then instructed the overseer to have Pierre's body removed before it attracted flies that might disturb the evening's dinner guests, treating the cleanup as a routine maintenance issue rather than the aftermath of a murder. His primary concern was ensuring that the plantation's daily operations continued smoothly and that the incident would not interfere with the social obligations and business relationships that sustained the family's position in Louisiana society. The body was to be disposed of quickly and quietly, buried in the slave cemetery without ceremony or recognition, just another entry in the plantation records that documented the births, deaths, and transfers of human property. As Jemima was forced to return to her duties in the kitchen, preparing meals for the family that had just murdered her son, she experienced a transformation that went beyond grief or anger to encompass a completely new understanding of her situation and her possibilities for response. The casual nature of Pierre's murder and the family's complete indifference to her loss forced her to confront the reality that no amount of loyal service, skillful work, or attempts to accommodate her oppressors would ever provide real security for herself or her surviving family members. She understood that Henri's action was not aberrant behavior that could be prevented through better management or appeal to conscience, but rather the logical expression of a system that viewed enslaved people as objects to be used for entertainment, experimentation, or disposal, according to the momentary desires of their owners. This recognition liberated her from any remaining illusions about the possibility of coexistence or gradual improvement, clearing the way for her to consider forms of resistance that she had previously rejected as too dangerous or extreme. That evening, as she served Henri his favorite dishes and watched him consume them with the thoughtless appetite of youth, making jokes with his friends about his improved marksmanship and discussing plans for future hunting expeditions, she made a decision that would echo through generations of American history. She would not run, would not attempt escape or open rebellion that would result in her death or capture while leaving the system intact and her oppressors free to continue their crimes against other families. Instead, she would remain exactly where she was, perfecting her craft, earning deeper trust, and planning something that would make Henri's casual cruelty seem like a gentle caress in comparison. Her revenge would be methodical, comprehensive, and absolutely devastating, designed not just to punish specific individuals, but to strike at the heart of the social system they represented and defended. The months following Pierre's murder were characterized by a performance of loyalty and submission that concealed the most systematic and scientific planning in the history of American resistance to slavery. Jemima maintained her reputation as the finest cook in Louisiana, while conducting research that would have impressed university botanists, testing dozens of different plant species, and documenting their effects with the precision of a trained scientist. She used the plantation's extensive grounds as her laboratory, identifying and cataloging toxic plants that grew wild in Louisiana's diverse ecosystems, while developing methods for processing them into forms that could be incorporated into food without detection. Her research was aided by Marie Tante's notebooks, which provided the theoretical foundation for her experimental work, but she went far beyond her mentor's knowledge by conducting systematic trials that tested different preparation methods, dosage levels, and timing strategies. Louisiana's subtropical climate and diverse plant communities provided her with an abundance of raw materials for her research, from the oleander bushes that lined the plantation's carriage drive to the wild mushrooms that sprouted in the deep forests that surrounded the property. She learned that the state's native flora included dozens of species with significant toxic properties, many of them previously unknown to European settlers but familiar to indigenous peoples and African traditional healers who had maintained botanical knowledge through oral transmission. Castor bean plants grew wild along the riverbank, their seeds containing ricin that could cause delayed death through organ failure. Water hemlock flourished in marshy areas, producing cytotoxin that would cause violent convulsions followed by respiratory paralysis. Wild cherry trees contained compounds that released hydrogen cyanide when processed incorrectly, while pokeweed roots yielded extracts that would disrupt cellular function throughout the human body. But Jemaima's most significant discovery was that certain combinations of plants could produce synergistic effects far more powerful than any single toxin, creating complex chemical reactions that would overwhelm multiple biological systems simultaneously, while making diagnosis and treatment impossible for physicians of the 1850s. She found that bitter compounds from unripe elderberries could enhance the absorption of other toxins when combined with specific preparation techniques, while extracts from native iris plants could mask the taste of more potent substances without reducing their effectiveness. The beauty of this approach was its sophistication and subtlety. Rather than relying on crude poisons that might be detected by taste or smell, she developed preparations that enhanced and complemented each other to create delayed reactions that would appear to be natural illness rather than deliberate poisoning. Her method required extensive knowledge of chemistry, biology, and pharmacology, disciplines that were barely understood by contemporary medical science, but which she mastered through careful observation and systematic experimentation. During this period of preparation, Jemima also studied her intended targets with the same scientific precision she applied to her botanical research. She analyzed their eating habits, food preferences, health conditions, and daily routines, building comprehensive profiles that would inform her selection of specific toxins and delivery methods for each individual. Judge Beaumont's preference for rich, complex sauces would easily mask the bitter taste of her more potent preparations, while Cordelia's delicate palate required more subtle approaches that would not alert her to anything unusual. Henri's robust constitution and enthusiastic appetite meant that he would consume generous portions of anything she prepared, but it also required her to develop more concentrated preparations to ensure that the effects would be both swift and irreversible. Through careful observation and strategic conversation, she learned about their medical histories, including Judge Beaumont's occasional digestive complaints that could explain unusual symptoms, Cordelia's tendency toward headaches that might mask the early effects of poisoning, and Henri's general good health that would require more aggressive intervention to overcome. This information became part of her strategic planning as she recognized that different victims would require customized approaches based on their individual vulnerabilities and the need to maintain plausible explanations for their symptoms that would not immediately suggest deliberate poisoning. She also studied the guest lists for major social events, identifying the key figures in Louisiana's slaveholding elite who might be vulnerable to a coordinated attack that could eliminate multiple targets simultaneously. The announcement of Judge Beaumont's appointment to the Louisiana Supreme Court provided the perfect opportunity, bringing together in one location many of the most influential defenders of slavery in the region, for a celebration that would allow her to strike a devastating blow against the system that had murdered her son and destroyed her family. As the first anniversary of Pierre's death approached, Jemima received news that crystallized her resolve into focused action. Judge Beaumont's appointment to the state's highest court would give him unprecedented power over the lives and deaths of enslaved people throughout Louisiana, allowing him to shape legal precedents that could influence the treatment of enslaved people for decades to come. His judicial philosophy, which treated enslaved people as property without rights or legal protections, would now be imposed through court decisions that other judges throughout the South would cite as authoritative precedents. The celebration dinner planned for August 15, 1854, would bring together the most prominent advocates for slavery in the region, creating a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to strike a coordinated blow against the leadership of Louisiana's slaveholding class. The guest list represented a concentration of wealth, power, and influence that could not be replicated under any other circumstances, offering Jemima the chance to eliminate multiple targets who had spent their careers defending and strengthening the system that had caused so much suffering for enslaved people throughout the South. This would not simply be revenge for Pierre's death, though his memory would guide every step of her preparation, but a calculated assault on the institutional foundations of slavery itself, designed to demonstrate that those who treated human beings as property did so at their own peril, and that justice, even when delayed, would eventually find its way to the tables where such crimes were planned and celebrated. The final weeks of preparation were characterized by meticulous attention to detail that reflected both Jemima's scientific approach to the problem and her understanding that she would have only one opportunity to execute her plan successfully. She dismissed her usual kitchen assistants, claiming that she wanted to handle this special dinner personally as a tribute to Judge Beaumont's achievement, an explanation that was readily accepted given the importance of the occasion and her reputation for culinary excellence. Working alone in the pre-dawn hours when the plantation slept, she began the complex process of transforming 15 months of research into a coordinated attack that would eliminate 15 of the most powerful defenders of slavery in Louisiana, while appearing to be nothing more than an tragic case of food poisoning. The menu she designed represented the pinnacle of Creole cuisine, each course showcasing different aspects of her culinary artistry while concealing preparations that had been calculated with scientific precision. The turtle soup that would open the meal contained extracts from multiple toxic plants, carefully balanced to prepare her guests, digestive systems for the more potent compounds that would follow in subsequent courses. The oysters from the Gulf would be served with mignonette sauce infused with concentrated plant extracts, their natural salinity helping to deliver the active compounds directly into the bloodstream, while their reputation for occasionally causing mild stomach upset provided perfect cover for any immediate reactions. The fish course featured pompano, prepared with a delicate sauce containing cardiac glycosides derived from oleander, compounds that would begin their assault on the cardiovascular system while remaining completely undetectable to contemporary medical science. The centerpiece of her deadly banquet was the main course, a perfectly prepared joint of beef that had been marinating in her special preparation for 3 days, absorbing a complex mixture of compounds that would interact with the previous courses to create an unstoppable cascade of organ failure. Each slice of the roast contained enough concentrated toxins to be lethal on its own, but the distribution throughout the meat would ensure that every guest received a fatal dose regardless of their appetite or serving preferences. The side dishes were designed to enhance and accelerate the effects of the main preparations: sweet potatoes glazed with pokeweed extract, green beans prepared with elderberry compounds, and rice cooked in stock that had been infused with extracts from a dozen different toxic plants. Even the bread carried death, baked with flour that had been carefully mixed with a fine, tasteless powder derived from ground seeds.